Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. Here at the Tenpenny Files, we have daily conversations that are meant to inform and educate, not just to entertain. I come prepared, and we let the discussion unfold naturally with people worth hearing on topics worth exploring. If it matters to your body, your freedom, or your future, we talk about it here. I talk to authors, documentary filmmakers, and independent thinkers whose work challenges mainstream messaging. We cover a wide range of topics from government, politics, and history to astronomy, pets, and travel to food, farming, and fitness to vaccines, health, and health policy. We also have a weekly conversation with authors or pastors who have written about and speak about faith and biblical principles. My goal is to introduce you to topics you've never heard of before or topics you've always wanted to explore but didn't know where to start. And we hope that our authors will be the ones that will lead you in the right direction. So join me here every day, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, to hear from voices who have been ignored, silenced, or censored, but truly have something important to say. So before we begin today's episode, I want to invite you to become a Tenpenny Prime member. Tenpenny Prime members receive exclusive monthly white papers, recorded presentations, and an Ask the Expert masterclass that I'm telling you they are over the moon. You can learn more by going to primemembership.drtenpenny.com, primemembership.drtenpenny.com to learn more and hopefully to support our work. Now, let's get started. Today's conversation is with senior editor of Epoch Times and host of the magnificent show, The American Thought Leaders, Jan Jekielek, to talk about his book, Killed to Order, China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary, a look at China's state-sanctioned harvesting of organs from prisoners of conscience. Jan, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm so excited to have you here. It's such an honor to have you on my show.
Dr. Tenpenny, the honor is all mine.
Well, your book, Killed to Order, is just such a riveting read. I mean, once you start pick it up and you start reading it, it's just a page turner. It just sucks you in. I mean, not only talking about the organ harvesting industry, but all the different things that were going on with China. In your book, at the beginning, you talk about the fact that you were trained as an evolutionary biologist and you became ill. And when you were not improving by conventional medicine, you were kind of serendipitously introduced to the practice of Falun Gong, which over time helped you to get well. And so that makes this whole story really personal to you. So tell us what Falun Gong is and what led you down the path to look into this organ harvesting industry.
Excellent question. And yeah, it was really by, I won't say by chance because I kind of see God's hand in these things, right? But it really kind of a providence. But no, basically, I mean, I was pretty much what you would call an agnostic, someone who believed that, I had actually chosen science as a good system by which I can sort of figure out how the world works. I was always interested in understanding the truth of things, right? And so that led me down the path of studying evolutionary biology in school and so forth. And I worked in Madagascar, and the last time I was there, I contracted something called an ascarid infection. It's kind of a parasitic worm infection, and I'm back in Alberta where my lab was, and I have mono, I have this ascarid infection, and I have kind of a really tough relationship that I was in. Okay, and I believe the combination of that triggered something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which of course you're very familiar with, and some of the viewers might be as well. There's some one of the COVID vaccines, the J&J actually has it as a known side effect, and it's basically an immune system going haywire and attacking the peripheral nervous system. It's a syndrome, so it's just kind of a collection of symptoms, if you will. But the effect of that collection of symptoms was it really destroyed my career because I was a geneticist. I was collecting samples in the field. I was bringing them back. I was working on them. And a lot of the fine motor skills and all of that weren't happening. And I had double vision and just like everything was not working well. Okay. And I didn't know. And it was, for a while it was getting worse. And then I wasn't sure where it would go. And, kind of along the way, right, I sort of made a promise, I guess you would say. And I said, I actually talked to God, as a lot of people do when this sort of thing, when faced with your own mortality. And I said, I'll dedicate my life to service, just in case, you're up there and taking care of things, and so, no, it was very interesting. And not long after that, actually, I met this guy who, he was just someone that I talked film with at a local coffee shop. It wasn't someone that I knew particularly well necessarily, but he, that was just our thing. And he told me that he had chronic fatigue syndrome, and he had used this slow motion exercise and meditation system to help himself. And I kind of course I said, well, sure, tell me about it. And he said, you should try this. I learned it off, you remember those low resolution DVDs called VCDs back in the day. I learned it from a grainy video on my computer screen. And there were these slow motion exercises and a sitting meditation that I did. And I tried it basically, and it just made me feel a little better for the first time in a while. So I just started implementing it as best I could, every day from then, from first trying. And basically within a better part of 2 months, like, I didn't really, it was a slow, incremental, very positive change. I felt better, so I kept doing it. And I wasn't deathly ill. So I had been in the hospital for, I think it was about a week. And at some point, I said, look, I don't really need to be at a hospital. If things go really bad, I'll call you and you can pick me up and bring me back here. I don't need to be wasting a hospital bed. I can, and I'm a pretty self-aware patient. So they let me, not be at the hospital. But as this all started happening, I was just kind of doing my thing, right? And I feeling better. I had a neurologist's appointment about 2 months in. Okay. And when I went to see her, she basically said, you are in full remission. She tested my reflexes. I had gotten my reflexes back, which was, that was one of the scary things at the beginning, because I had completely lost them. The kind of like party trick reflex where you hit the just below the patella, right? And it kicks. Yeah, it was fully back. And I just felt, I didn't fully grasp that I had completely recovered until she, kind of shocked, said, you're in complete remission. And here's the really interesting part of the story, right? This is something, and of course, I've told this story a number of times, right, through my life in the different manifestations. But my wife, when I talked about it with my wife, 22 years ago, we've been married 21 years right now, right? She mentioned to me, I told her, I said, oh yeah, that doctor, did she ever ask you what it was that you did to heal yourself, right? And I thought about it. I was like, come to think of it, no, actually, no, she never did. She said this, I kid you not, she said, whatever it is you're doing, keep doing it. So she was positive, she was encouraging, right? She was amazed. She's, you're in complete remission. But she never was curious. Odd at that, I'd never thought about it until my wife pointed it out, right? She wasn't curious enough to ask what it was that had caused this, right? This sudden spontaneous remission, right, as she called it. So anyway, that's kind of the story. And in the process, I tried to find out what it was that I was doing, right? Really, right? And I learned that it's truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. These are the core principles, that these exercises are viewed as supplemental to this whole practice. And so I started studying these teachings to try to understand, better. I met people that were actually doing this, right? At the University of Alberta, where I was. There was a postdoc whose mother had actually escaped from China. So unbeknownst to me, the Chinese Communist Party had started persecuting this group right around the same time as I had gotten Guillain-Barré. Okay, like right about at the same time. And then I kind of healed myself. And now, people were being incarcerated, being tortured. And this is this woman that had escaped from China, whose daughter was a postdoc, I think in the Department of Chemistry or something. Now I have to check. But she basically was telling me through her daughter as a translator, like, they gave me a piece of paper. It was 3 statements I had to sign, right, to agree to. But basically that you have to renounce your belief, and you have to try to re-educate others, contribute, do your part to re-educate others. Okay, that was the idea. And this woman said, of course I'm not going to sign this. This is insane, right? Like, and I was just listening to all this, right? And they tortured her. they tortured her to get her to do it, right? And to me, the whole thing was so bizarre, right? Because like, what do you mean you can like, because here's the thing, right? Whenever someone is being persecuted or someone's in jail or whatever, you think to yourself, what did you do? What did you do? Right? Like that's how our minds work, right? And I realized with this, like that she could sign a piece of paper and leave. Like that, obviously you didn't do anything wrong. And then like I had this moment, and every time I talk about this, okay, I get this massive shiver down my spine, which I am getting again, as I always do, and I think about this moment. But it's like everything. My parents had escaped communist Poland in the 70s, and we had all these weird behaviors in our family, right, where like you couldn't talk about anything from in the family, outside the family. It was really frustrating because you couldn't say my parents are driving me crazy or whatever, right? And they taught me communism was bad and everything, but they escaped it, right? But I didn't really understand why. I grew up in this super free society, right, in Canada, right, in the 70s and 80s, and just it just hit me, like it just went through me. I was, oh my god, this is communism. This is how it works. They take the it's the freedom of thought of this person that's the threat, right? This is why they're persecuting. This person has done nothing wrong, right? And I knew at that moment that my kind of commitment to giving my life to service, which is what I promised went back, when I was some months before, when I was, facing my mortality, that this would be my service. I would try to help these people. And I don't know. So I didn't know at the time exactly how that would happen, but it led me to do China-related human rights work, and ultimately led me to the Epoch Times because there was this huge narrative at the time. Okay, and this was like a 90-95-5 narrative. Okay, we say 80-20, all that, right? But basically, the narrative was, I call it the Kissinger doctrine. If we pump enough cash into China, it's going to become a democracy. It's going to liberalize. It's going to become South Korea or Taiwan or something like that, right? And I already knew by the fact that they were torturing people for their faith, for their beliefs, that this is false. Like you can't have a society that's doing extreme things to people around their core identity and beliefs. That's liberalizing. That's not liberalizing. But everybody believed it. There were all sorts, left, right, up and down. It was just the standard view. Okay. And so Epoch was the only media. I was doing this human rights work. I had these amazing stories I wanted to tell of people, basically against all odds, escaping, no one wanted to touch it because the narrative was wrong. The narrative suggested that there's something wrong in China, that it isn't liberalizing, and all this stuff. So Epoch was kind of, I don't know what to call it. Like it was this haven. It was tiny, tiny at the time, but they were, I came to them with these stories, and unlike every single other media that I had talked to, big and small, they were like, we live for this. This is what we need. Give us everything you got. And my wife and I, we sort of fell in love with Epoch and have been there for, over 20 years, working with them. Yeah.
In your book, you paint a really vivid and pretty grisly picture of the Chinese Communist Party, from blacklists to the one-child rule to the utilitarian bioethics of individual sacrifice to enforce the undivided loyalty to the party. This helps to explain somewhat the attack on Falun Gong, and you make it so clear that they are just a peace-loving, kind, generous sort of people, and that was so opposed to the Communist Party. I think listeners need to really understand this and really understand what is really going on with the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't think that anyone that's in the country currently today advocating for Marxism and communism in this country really understands how bad it really is. I mean, when you write this, did you experience that? Did you go to China and experience that, or does it from your family history, or where did you because you write with such passion, you can actually feel it when you read the book. It's not just words on the paper, that you just really can feel what's going on there.
Well, it does come from my family at the beginning of it, right? Because my family, both, both of my sides of my family suffered under various totalitarian regimes, let's say, okay? And so I'm very familiar with these kinds of realities. And my parents, my mother basically, she had to flee because see, my mother wasn't one of these sort of activists in any communist society. There's people that resist the system, right? That are sort of, but a surprising number don't, by the way, just that's something that I've learned just, watching the last, say, 5 to 10 years of life here in the West. But she wasn't one of these big activists that would put up a sign that said, in down with communism or something like that, right? But what she was she was like part of this group of what you call passive resistors, which are people that think you never would learn Russian, right? Because they viewed it as Russian occupation. You would, when the commissars and various communists wanted you to do stuff for them, you would just try to avoid it at all costs. You would try, there's just basically there's a whole kind of system that people develop to try to not be complicit, despite the system demanding you be, right? Which is kind of how communist societies work. And at one point, she was called in to the security, and they basically said, "Hey, we need you to tell us about X person and what they were doing last night." And at that moment, she had to reveal herself, because she basically said, "Look, I'm not." You couldn't say no, by the way. You couldn't. This is the crazy thing in these situations, that if I said no, I would be in jail. But I didn't say that. I said, "I'm just not made out for this kind of thing." It's just like you're always trying to kind of be very light and fluffy. But the effect of that was that she lost her travel documents. She lost her ability. She had been like she had been able to kind of function in the society at a reasonable level, but she lost all that. And that's when she made up her mind. I want to have kids. But I want them to grow up in a free society. So they escaped. And there's a whole amazing story about how she did that, and got my father out, and so forth. But so it comes from that. Okay. But then the second part, right? I ended up, and again, sort of, I see God's hand in a lot of things that I do, really. And just by an amazing, again, providence or serendipity, I ended up getting a job, not having ever worked in Thailand, but I got a job working in Thailand running international youth programs, which is something I had done. It was just kind of a surprising placement for someone that had never done that particular type of place. And it turned out that my wife actually had worked and lived in Thailand before and spoke the language. So we both went, and I worked in the countryside. She stayed in Bangkok, and she discovered this whole underground railroad of people who were being, prisoners of conscience, being brought from China through this golden triangle, this kind of treacherous, lawless area, into Bangkok, where they could actually get refugee status, UN refugee status, and get placements to safe countries. I think there were 6 of them. I talk a little bit about this in the book as well. And so it was just this amazing thing. We've never needed a lot to get by. Like, both, that's something my wife and I share. We're very adventurous, and we're just very happy with not a lot. And it was just a natural place for us to stay for a while. And the way that we were able to help them is that the Chinese would always pressure the Thais, okay? And the Thais would kind of want to they don't want to make enemies with anybody, right? So they wouldn't arrest the various refugees that were in the country, even though they were perfectly allowed to. It was a unusual refugee situation where the Thais have never signed the convention, so everybody there was technically illegal. But they kind of tolerated it because they didn't want trouble with the UN or with the US. So it actually helped. They were able to help a lot of people too. But at the same time, the regimes would be there, like the Chinese regime would say, arrest these people, send them back to China. And once in a while, they felt they had to, comply to show that they're not against the Chinese entirely. And they would do that. And then it was an emergency, because we had to either get them placement to these free countries, or they would get sent back to China. So that was kind of the role Cindy and I played. We did our darndest to stop any of those deportations from happening. And we were able to, just because of the nature of our background and a little bit of the color of our skin, to be perfectly honest, we were able to help in that respect on this Underground Railroad. And this is where I first, so I encountered people who had suffered unbelievable realities. I mean, there's a whole, so actually in Xiao Fu in the book, I talk about her, this amazing woman. She was the first Falun Gong refugee accepted to the US. I mean, she was like a, kind of a senior sales manager in a kind of mid-sized regional company, kind of like a, model citizen, all this kind of stuff. But then when they made the Falun Gong illegal, she became a traitor immediately, and they arrested her, they tortured her to the point of paralysis, right? And and she ended up escaping because she actually got better, but she was able to not move, and the guards had just kind of had forgotten that she could believe that she couldn't move because she appeared paralyzed, and she was actually able to escape and ultimately find this railroad. But like, just amazing stories, right? Individual stories about people overcoming, unbelievable odds. And then I saw firsthand how the Chinese were able to, push what's called transnational repression, push their persecution out through into places like Thailand and other countries in the region, where again, lots of stories, some of them aren't in the book either. At this point, I had actually faced off with a Chinese diplomat. I was working on the NGO side of the UN at the Human Rights Commission in Geneva in 2005. And at that point, we had become kind of marked as people that were not pro CCP, pro Chinese Communist Party. So that, caused some problems for us, but it also made it so we couldn't really travel into the country because for obvious reasons, right? So I think Hong Kong is kind of where as well I got to see a lot of this sort of dynamic that I was just describing.
This persecution of the Falun Gong started in around 1999, but you talk about in great details about that in the book, about where you think it started. But it was by 2005, it was discovered in just one of 400 hospitals that were performing organ transplants in China, and more surgeries were being performed than could reasonably be the sum of all execution of criminals, which is how they sell this. We're just, these people were going to be executed anyway, so we will harvest their organs. And that was the first time that this really kind of started to come out, at least in the mainstream. I remember that, that we're talking about that. But how pervasive is this problem of how many people are being killed for and alive? Sometimes their organs are harvested when they haven't even killed them, they're still alive. How really pervasive is this problem?
Well, let me just maybe define it and explain why this particular system is unique and a human rights violation that we would call an atrocity or a crime against humanity. That's sort of beyond your typical really horrible black market organ industry that you see in places around the world. So you need a state actor. You need someone who a group that can push massive coercive power through a population, right? And they also have to be able to dehumanize a group of people, to have so much propaganda power, hold so much media and propaganda resources to basically be able to demonize a large group of people. This is what happened to Xiao Fu. I mentioned she was a model citizen one day. The next day, the loudspeakers are blaring that she's a traitor and that she's evil, right? And everyone is sort of, oh my God, what's happening, right? And they have to kind of get in line. So this is you have to be able to push that propaganda through the system. I heard there were 500,000 individual pieces of that propaganda that went out in that first year, and or I think that was the calculation that was made by one group. And then you have to be able to have the power to incarcerate a large group of people. Okay, and so say 1 million or 2 million. It's unclear. Again, it's kind of a state secret, right? But if you can do all that, then you have a unique situation, and where I also theorize in the book where I think it started exactly. But basically, they started blood typing, tissue typing, organ scanning people. And now, right, someone like me or someone who has maybe looser morals than I do, okay, could read an ad, and there were actually ads online, and we had these archived, right, that said, in 2 weeks, if you have the right amount of money, say $200,000, you can get a new heart in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, scheduled. So we know exactly when that or operation is going to happen, which means when that person will be dead, because you don't survive having a heart extracted from you as a so-called donor. The only way that can happen, right, is that there's a database of all these blood types, tissue types, and organ scans. And these people are already incarcerated, prisoners of conscience, ready to be killed to order the moment the match is made and the money is paid. And then they're shipped and killed. And that's why the book is called Killed to Order, because that's what happened. And the scale, I mean, it's horrible. But basically, in 2000, there was this very low level of some maybe experimental organ transplantation, maybe some super elites were getting it. But the moment the Falun Gong persecution begins and they demonize that and incarcerate, let's say, millions, okay, we don't know the exact number, it grows geometrically. They build thousands of transplant hospitals, okay? And that it kind of plateaus a bit at 2005 and grows a bit more. And then by the early 2000s, we're looking at 60 to 90,000 transplants per year. To frame that, right, the US broke a record on transplants, I believe, last year, 40,000. That was the number. And here we're looking at 60. 60 is the low end estimate. It's very hard to estimate, right? I could explain how that estimation is done. Some of the best estimation was done by a man named Ethan Gutman, who's one of the heroes of the, developing the research base around all this material. But so that's the scale. We estimate it's about a $9 billion a year industry. And as of today, there's no evidence that these numbers have dropped off. Now,
Wow.
one of the really horrifying things is that
Hold that
yeah.
thought right there, Jan, because we need to take a short break to hear from our sponsors right now at this point in time. But hold that. We'll come back to what are some of the most horrifying things, because this is just a horrifying topic. And there's so much more to come. We have so much to talk about. Wish we could go on for several hours here because it's interesting, informative, and very important. So we're going to hear from our sponsors now. America Out Loud Talk Radio plays the Tenpenny Files on the iHeartRadio network daily at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can also listen anywhere in the world from AmericaOutloud.news media player. If you've missed any of these great conversations, you can find the Tenpenny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studio, and on my platforms at drtenpenny.com, drtenpenny.substack.com, on X, Instagram, and Rumble. Because there are so many great books and so many great documentaries, and we all have too little time to read and to watch, this show is meant to jumpstart your interest and lead you in the right direction for further study. We've got a great message coming up from our sponsors. Listen closely, sit tight, and we will be right back. More with Jan Jekielek on Killed to Order, China's organ harvesting industry. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out. The heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to drtenpenny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Today's conversation is with Jan Jekielek, to talk about his book, Killed to Order, China's Organ Harvesting Industry with the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary, and a look at China's state-sanctioned harvesting of organs from prisoners of conscience. Let me tell you a little bit more about Jan. He is the senior editor from Epoch Times and the host of the great show American Thought Leaders. And if you haven't watched it, listen to it, and you're not a subscriber to Epoch Times, you are missing it. You need to be there. Jan's career has spanned academia, international human rights work, and now for almost 2 decades, he has been a prominent figure in the media. He has interviewed nearly 1,000 thought leaders on camera and specializes in long form discussions that challenge the grand narratives of our time. And he's also an award winning documentary filmmaker. Jan, it is just such a pleasure here to talk to you about this really dicey topic that we're talking about from your book, Killed to Order. And you say that the CCP in your book, you say that they created an unwritten rule that all Falun Gong deaths in custody should be recorded as suicides, giving the government a license to kill. Can you say what sort of outside political forces are in place to try to reverse this?
Wow, that is a very difficult question to answer because you know, there has not been a ton of incredibly effective efforts to try to stop this Falun Gong persecution from outside governments. I mean, to be perfectly frank, there has been some great work with groups like the Congressional Executive Commission on China, for example, is a congressional body that has done good work. Okay, that's unfortunately a rare exception. There's been USCIRF, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, has done very good work. There's a body, Freedom House has done amazing reports on freedom of religion in China and so forth, which I've really appreciated. But in terms of like actual efforts like that would have teeth to help stop the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China, I have not seen much in that vein, aside from resolutions that where people say this is horrible, or even about the forced organ harvesting, this is horrible. And in fact, in the book, I make some suggestions about how we could actually, do some things that aren't even that difficult to do to at least stop our own complicity in some of this as Americans or Canadians. And also actually kind of reduce the volume a bit. I think there's ways to do that. I don't know if we could completely stop it, but we could try. We could, and it's not very hard, and it's not even like it's not a heavy lift. Like we don't have to restructure, entire bureaucracies or something like that. Before I finish, I just want to add one more thing. I was just talking before the break about how we don't believe the numbers have dropped in any significant matter from that 60 to 90,000 transplants a year, because we would see that in basically hospital bed use and other type. There's a whole bunch of ways that we are able to kind of create these estimates, which are very hard to do, obviously, in the first place. What happened was that since no one really did much for 14 or 15 years, so by 2015, the Chinese regime picked another group. So they started on the Falun Gong. They've spent 14, 15 years with Falun Gong being the primary kind of pool for this crime against humanity. And then they said, well, no one's really done anything. I mean, I'm kind of inferring here and say, well, let's dehumanize another group of people, the Uyghurs in the Northwest, in a military controlled, isolated region, right? Who are also happen to be Muslim and, and look different. So it's kind of easy to dehumanize a group of people that are different in so many ways. And then they incarcerated 1 million of them or more. And we believe they started working on them. And in fact, Ethan Gutman, who I mentioned earlier, is actually working on a book which will come out fairly soon called The Xinjiang Procedure. He originally wrote a book called The Slaughter, basically documenting that reality around the Falun Gong. Today, he's almost finished a book titled The Xinjiang Procedure, which looks at how this whole operation works on the Uyghurs now. And he's even documented one example, at least, where there is a prison or some sort of concentration camp, a hospital, and a crematorium kind of all side by side sitting to get built, presumably to facilitate this whole horrible process. And I'm worried, and I just want to add this too. I'm watching right now, and I was just talking with Bob Fu on the phone. I'm going to have him on my show soon. Bob runs a very important ministry in Midland, Texas, and he supports a lot of Chinese Christians. Okay. There's been this increase in Christian house church Christian persecution, with the Zion church leaders being all wrapped up. There's still, many of them are still incarcerated. In fact, I just had his daughter on the show, Grace Jean, who's in America, about all this issue, and they're starting to control Catholic clergy. And I'm seeing an increase in dehumanizing rhetoric. The reason I mentioned Bob is I talked to him on the phone today. And I said, "Listen, are you seeing this too? Are you seeing an increase in because the dehumanizing rhetoric, as it's being rolled out, that's always kind of a prerequisite to atrocity. Because again, like most people, the reason why that is always kind of a necessary part of these crimes against humanity level type things is that most people aren't psychopaths. Most people are not ready to harm their fellow man casually. But if you could kind of trick them into believing that they're lesser than, or they're evil or something, right, then it's a lot more palatable. It's a weird thing in our psyche. And he told me, yeah, and actually I am seeing the same thing you're seeing. So I'm actually concerned that the Christians may be the next group, right? Like, why not? What's stopping that? What have we done? What has anybody said that had teeth? What policy has anyone implemented that has teeth thus far to actually try to help stop this? And the answer is not really much at all over 26 years, but we have a chance to do that now.
You know, back in 2008, I was the medical director of a small integrative health hospital in Mexico. And that was about the time that the medical tourism industry was getting started, that people could go overseas for cancer treatments and breast augmentations and all kinds of different surgeries. And in the in the forward of your book of Killed to Order, written by a highly credentialed Dr. Joseph Varon from Texas, he describes that the Chinese medical system has created money by transplant tourism. And just the term of that is just so appalling. And he describes how physicians involved with organ harvesting have become indistinguishable from executioners. How do you think that hard evidence should resonate with American physicians and the practice of medicine here? And an extension to that, all the things that have started happening in Canada about the MAID, medical assisted, independent suicides. And there was just an article in the paper today talking about a woman who was actually killed against her will. And is this going to roll over into other countries? Should other countries such as Canada and places be examined for these same sort of atrocities of transplant tourism?
Well, this is the horrible thing. We had this idea of this narrative, right? The narrative was that we're going to change China. We're a democracy. If we pump enough cash in there, it's going to become a South Korea or a Taiwan. We're going to change them, right? It was a very convenient narrative for people who are looking to make a lot of money there, and we're making partnerships and so forth, right? So that's kind of where we started. The problem is when you create this engagement, right? It does facilitate change. It does facilitate, I guess, an evolution of thinking. But what happened was it wasn't us actually changing people towards a more liberal and open society. It actually happened in the other direction. Okay. And so the effect was, and I actually wrote about this in an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun a couple of months ago, is, we've had in 2025, we had 2 transplant systems that were decertified by HHS because they were violating the dead donor rule systemically. Okay. And how does that happen? Well, it just means that we've become very, very casual about who we allow to be used as an organ donor. And what's the lesson? Well, in communist China, essentially everybody, with possible some very few exceptions, is someone that's being, dead donor rule violated, right? And basically murdered for an organ. And that has rubbed off on us, right? So the answer is, we can't cooperate with a system that does these kinds of things. And I think that the simplest, most obvious thing that we can do. And there's various, and I talk in the book extensively about various ways we could do that right off the bat without a lot of complication, is just not participate in a system. We've trained so many of these surgeons. We don't need to train Chinese surgeons until they can demonstrate unequivocally with an independent inquiry that they are no longer killing people for organs. Okay. And similarly, we don't need to fund research with, transplant components by through NIH or other, which some of this exists today, right? And we're kind of in the process of trying to put together, to the best of our knowledge, how much of this is there. We're digging, but that's actually a bit difficult to get at some of this information. So this is something, maybe I know you have a lot of medical practitioners that watch your show, that participate. Maybe there are people who can help and gather some of this information, and so that we can actually present it in a comprehensive report to HHS, to Congress, and just say, look, here's the range of ways in which we have, and we know already that we supply solutions and technologies. Curiously, right, they manufacture many things over there, but a lot of the things they use for transplantation come from Europe and the US, as it turns out, as I even learned only for the first time in the last few years. You're always learning new things, right, in this system. So there's all sorts of ways we can sort of, stop our own complicity as a starting point. That's the easiest part. But I also feel there's ways that we can actually help reduce that volume substantively. I don't know if we can completely stop it, but if we make an effort and we, sort of make it a point and we call it out for what it is, I think there's all sorts of ways that we can have a substantive impact on saving some lives.
In America, you were talking about I didn't know that about those sites that have been decredentialed, but there's actual in writing plans to redefine the definition of death, because some people that in America who they have sent to do organ transplant, they weren't dead. And the nurses in the operating room noticed that, a finger moved or the eyelid fleshed or something like that when they started to cut them open to extract the organs. So this is, I believe, much more extensive. You're uncovering all of this and really exposing it in writing of what's happening in China. I think it's a lot broader than what we might know. I mean, there was a lot of things that we learned when we went into Ukraine about what they were doing with organ harvesting and things with prisoners and things there. After hearing your disturbing expose about these things, and you've alluded to it a couple of times here, but what concrete steps can Congress and Trump take right now that would help to expose and halt this organ trade?
Well, so at the administration level, I think there's just all cooperation in any form with transplantation stops unless, until there's demonstrated change. And this is difficult because there's a massive bureaucracy system that's been created, that's been running for 26 years doing this at an industrial scale, right? So, you need to have some pretty strong evidence to see that system is being dismantled in some way, right? To change our own policies. That would be what I would say. But also at the congressional level, there's actually, this is what's really kind of exciting to me, both at the state House and Senate level and at the federal level. There's been an unusual level of interest in this issue in the last few years. Perhaps it's because there's actually a survivor who came out publicly. And of course, I talk about him, Chung Pei-ming. It's a miracle that there's a survivor. I encourage you to read the book. By the way, you can get the book at killedtoorder.com. I have the first physical copy came to me on Friday. It comes out March 17th. There aren't that many around yet, but it's kind of surreal almost to have it in my hands, right? But there's actually multiple pieces of legislation. Two have passed the House at the federal level near unanimously. One is called the Falun Gong Protection Act. And by the way, the Falun Gong Protection Act doesn't just protect Falun Gong, it just kind of names them as a major group this way that was the subject of this organ harvesting. But what it does is it sanctions individuals that are involved in this. There's a reporting element. It's not a very complicated or expensive piece of legislation, but it kind of draws the line and it says people involved in this, we're not going to let them, basically participate in the US system. And right. And so that's great. That there's a lot of, China is a bit of a chaotic place right now, increasingly so. There's every Chinese super elite has an exit strategy to somewhere. Many of them are to America. They're going to think a lot more about whether they want to keep participating in this system if they know that they're going to get hit with hard sanctions from the US if they are known to have participated. So I expect a whole bunch of people will exit participating in it just from that. There's another piece of legislation called the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act, a bit broader, not just focused on China, but identifying China as a specific problem. And likewise, again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but an excellent piece of legislation that would help, at least in part, in a similar way. So that's at the federal level. There's a third piece of legislation, which what it does is it stops Medicare, Medicaid, and insurance for paying for China transplants. At the federal level, that's Congressman Dunn. He's actually retiring this year. It's in committee. Perhaps it'll get out of committee. Perhaps it'll pass the House. But there's two pieces that are just waiting for the Senate to look at. And I think that the Senate would probably pretty quickly say, this is very reasonable. This is the least partisan issue you can possibly imagine. Basically challenge an obvious crime against humanity, right? Like, and even if you don't believe it's happening, then then the legislation won't do anything. You might as well pass it anyway. You see what I'm saying? So it's kind of no-brainer legislation. But even at the state level, Dr. Tenpenny, there's been 6 states out of 50 now that starting in 2022 or 2021 that have passed legislation similar to this, what's called the Block Act, prevent payments from Medicare, from insurance at the state level for being used for China transplants and related items. So there's activity for the first time in the last few years. I'm hopeful.
Well, that's really great. You mentioned in the book several times that you've been doing this for over 20 years and been hard getting people interested in it because it's such a hard and heinous a topic for people to talk about. It's just so disgusting. But I think now that a lot of disgusting things have become pretty mainstream in our vernacular, talking about pedophilia and human trafficking and things that have been so abhorrent, what they found with childhood harvesting in some of the Ukraine places. And it's come into our psyche and into our conversation now, unfortunately, because it's so disgusting but it is there. And I think that gives a platform for people to be able to talk about this organ harvesting and how despicable it is and why we need to stop it. And in fact, in the last part of your book, you actually have an appendix, and you alluded to this a little bit in our conversation about actions that everyone can take to get this notification out. Why don't you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, something that's really exciting in a way, right? We have these Rotary clubs all over the world, but certainly all over America. I first encountered them when I was doing these international youth programs. They're always super helpful people in Rotary. Okay, you always know you can count on Rotary, right? So the amazing thing is there's actually an End Forced Organ Harvesting Rotary Club, like dedicated to this issue, that it's called a satellite club. Typically they're local clubs, but this one, there were a few people from local clubs that decided this is an important issue that's important enough. And they work with Rotary clubs all over America and all over the world to basically expose this stuff by screening excellent films. There's a film, actually, I just interviewed the director of one of them not too long ago on American thought leaders, Raymond, called State Organs. It was an Oscar contender from Canada on this issue. It's a powerful, powerful film. And what these guys do is they set up screenings. They get books into libraries. This is grassroots, local level people who are like genuinely wanting to make a difference in their local communities tend to go to Rotary. So I think it's just an exciting little structure, and it's actually not hard to participate in Rotary these days, wherever you are. I think once upon a time you had to be some kind of business leader or something. No, it's been quite democratized now. And if you're interested, these clubs exist and they want to talk to you. In fact, there's someone here in the DC area as we're speaking right now who is very extremely active. I think she's about to become a chapter president and is pushing this issue hard through her club and this related End Forced Organ Harvesting satellite club.
And I think that Rotary Club International, I mean, it's all over the world. It's just not here.
That's right.
Well, in the last,
In fact, it's in Taiwan, as it would happen, that they're having their international meetings. I just learned that.
oh,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Well, we've
Mhm.
got about 2 minutes left, Jan, and this has been such an interesting conversation. I wish that we could go on much longer. But in your book, Kill to Order China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary, tell us again where's the best place to get the book, and tell us what your major takeaway is from this book you want our audience to know today.
The big thing, so again, here's the book, highly recommended,
Very highly
killedtoorder.com.
recommended, very highly recommended by me.
Killedtoorder.com. No, thank you. I know you told me earlier how read it. I was so thrilled that you liked it so much. But really, I think it's a tool, right? And a big part of the book is helping understand how communism works. And just on this point of the Epstein files, making us realize the darkness in our own society. This is all true, and we need to deal with it. Okay. But I think it's also important to understand that the best thing, the most powerful tool the communists have is propaganda. And right now they're busy trying to convince us that our society is horrible, that their society is somehow better. And I'm trying to say, listen, you don't think that way. We can change things here. We can actually make a difference here. Nobody has that ability because there's an iron fist regime that does this kind of thing for 26 years for massive profit and elite longevity. And no one can do anything about it in there, right? Until the system crumbles from within, which it always does. Here, it very much still is a democratic system, and we're affecting change here. We need to believe we can and do that action ourselves. And that's essentially, that's why that's the constitutional republic that we're in here, right? And we can affect our own. This is my last moment here, right? De Tocqueville, in Democracy of America, what he loved, what he said makes America great, is people getting together around issues that matter and basically creating a structure which we could call civil society and getting the job done around that issue. That's the best thing about America. That's what he saw. That's how he foretold that America would be incredibly effective. And I still think it is, and we can still do exactly that. So that's what I encourage. And
Well,
kiltsorder.com, get the book.
get
Yeah.
the book because I'm telling you it's riveting. Because even though Jan talks about these really abhorrent sort of things, it's not written like bloody, gory. It's not a gore book. It's a historical and a very well written, thought out book to bring attention to a very important topic. So Jan, I want to thank you so much for being part of our show today. I'm sure that many people are going to get this book and will follow some of your instructions and that you leave at the end of the book. So I want to close out. I want to thank all of our listeners for being here today. I want to close out with one of my favorite verses from the Bible. I close all my podcasts with, whether they are live or pre-recorded, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. We will see you tomorrow or the next time on AmericaOutloud.news, iHeartRadio, or one of the Tenpenny platforms that you can watch this, listen, and share it with others. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Goodbye and God bless.